The Crusader county of Edessa falls to Muslim forces on Christmas Day, 1144. Western Europe answers, a new crusade is proclaimed and thousands swear to reclaim the lost city. But 3 years later, the Crusaders are not besieging Edessa. They are marching hundreds of miles away towards the walls of Damascus. Even worse, they're about to make a mistake so baffling that historians still argue over why they did it. So, how did the expedition lose its purpose so completely and shattered itself against the walls of the wrong city? This is the story of the fiasco that was the Second Crusade. Buckle up and let's see why it failed so badly. 50 years before, the First Crusade ended in victory, establishing 4 Crusader states in the Levant around the year 1100: Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. If you want to see how that story unfolded, I highly recommend our episode dedicated to the First Crusade, card at the top. Now the Crusader states held key towns, castles, and the coastline, but geography worked against them. Their territories were stretched and pressed by major Muslim cities. Edessa was the weakest point in that line. It sat farther inland than the others, up toward the upper Euphrates, with a population consisting mainly of Armenians and Syrians. In 1144, 52 years after its foundation, the county of Edessa fell to the Seljuk Turks under Zengi, the powerful Muslim ruler of Mosul and Aleppo. The victory strengthened his standing across the region. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I had his own priorities and suspicions about large Western armies moving again toward Constantinople. In short, Edessa changed hands when the political landscape of the East was already crowded with competing interests, fragile trust, and little margin for error. News about the fall of Edessa found King Louis VII of France already thinking about a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to atone for his sins. When Pope Eugenius III issued the first formal crusade bull in December 1145, Louis emerged as an enthusiastic early supporter of the campaign. At first, that commitment did not produce the wave Louis needed. Support in France was uneven, with some of his nobility opposing the trip. That changed in 1146, when the charismatic abbot Bernard of Clairvaux preached the crusade and his sermon transformed the mood. Contemporary tradition held that so many men took the cross that Bernard ran short of cloth badges. He gave the movement moral force, papal backing gave it structure, and Louis suddenly had a crusade large enough to lead. But there was a problem. German King Conrad III reluctantly took the cross as well after Bernard preached the crusade in German lands the following year. Conrad was not going to let Louis take all the glory, plus he needed a strong appearance to consolidate his rule. You might be thinking, the more people who joined the crusade, the better. So why was Conrad's participation a problem? Well, for 3 reasons. First, 2 kings meant 2 separate armies, 2 royal courts, 2 groups of advisors, and no unified rule of the expedition. Second, logistics became an issue as both armies had to coordinate and draw from the same pool of resources along the way. Third, the 2 rulers shared the vow without sharing the same instincts. Louis VII was the happy-go-lucky king, accompanied by his wife, Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine. Conrad, by contrast, had spent years in dynastic struggle inside Germany before becoming king in 1138, and he entered the crusade more cautiously. This was the first major weakness in the Second Crusade. None of them solved the, small issue of how 2 kings were supposed to run one campaign without inventing extra trouble. Neither could easily yield without losing face, and neither could easily compel the other once a dispute hardened. Under that divided command, the root question became the first major strategic test. In theory, the Crusaders could have sailed east. In practice, the sea option ran through the lands of King Roger II of Sicily, and that made both monarchs wary. Roger offered sea passage to both Conrad and Louis, but Conrad was on especially bad terms with him, and Roger further complicated matters by fighting Byzantium at the same time. So both kings chose the overland road through the Byzantine Empire of Manuel I. The 2 Crusader contingents never met along the way to Constantinople. Conrad and Manuel remained on good terms. The German contingent made it to Constantinople 1 month ahead of Louis, and Manuel advised Conrad to follow the coastal route around Asia Minor. Conrad rejected that advice, moved his main force directly into Anatolia, and exposed his army to the exact mix of distance, thirst, and Turk attack that would soon break it. But we'll get back to that. Louis too had chosen the overland march despite Roger's offer, but his relations with Manuel were less easy. Diplomacy was already strained by earlier Frankish crusader plundering, and as he arrived to Constantinople, he learned that Manuel had signed a truce with the Seljuk Turks. In response, Louis's hot-headed followers accused Manuel of treason and urged Louis to join Roger in attacking Byzantium. Louis remembered why they were there, and he refused. He listened to calmer advisors and agreed to restore any imperial lands he might capture. That decision prevented a disastrous split with Byzantium. Back to Conrad, he rushed forward without waiting for Louis, and he was now pushing into Anatolia, a region known for charging interest on errors. Marching into dry land, his army was weary and short of provisions by the time they neared Dorylaeum in late October, 1147. Seljuk forces under Sultan Mesud I could now strike repeatedly and then pull away as thirst and hunger took their toll on Conrad's men. They faced daily harassing attacks by Turkish horse archers, especially once the Crusaders moved beyond effective Byzantine control. By the time the Germans were several days beyond Dorylaeum, some nobles wanted to turn back and regroup. That retreat only exposed the army further. On October 25th, Seljuk attacks intensified and the withdrawal turned into a rout. Conrad himself was wounded by arrows. The German Crusader army was virtually destroyed, with more than 2/3 of its soldiers killed or captured. Conrad retreated with a few survivors to Nicaea, and the German force that had set out as one of the great pillars of the Crusade no longer existed as an effective independent army. Some survivors later moved on with the French along the coast, while Conrad eventually returned by sea to Constantinople before continuing east. So the first major field decision of the campaign had already ruined one royal army before the Crusade even reached Syria. A rather poor return on the shortcut. This failure put more weight on Louis's army at the exact moment the expedition needed strength, flexibility, and confidence. After learning of the German disaster at Dorylaeum, Louis and the remaining Crusaders shifted to the coastal route through Western Asia Minor instead of pushing straight into Anatolia. But the lesson was only half learned. The French still had to move a large, tired army through hostile country in winter, with Turks close enough to strike whenever the column stretched out. At Mount Cadmus, in southern Anatolia, the French vanguard moved too far ahead of the main body. Louis, travelling with the central column, did not close the gap in time. Once the ranks lost shape, the Seljuks of Rum had exactly the chance they needed. In the narrow ground of the pass, with cliffs on one side and crags on the other, the Seljuks drove men, horses, and baggage into the abyss. There's a famous story that Louis survived only by taking refuge on a rocky ledge, fighting off attackers until dark. So Louis repeated Conrad's lesson in a slightly different form. He did not choose the same shortcut, but he still allowed terrain and stretched lines to hand the Seljuks another victory. About 7,000 Crusaders were lost, along with their entire baggage train. The remaining contingent made it to Attaleia, present-day Antalya. Please consider subscribing if you made it this far. It will help us grow. Back to the story. The French king chose to continue the journey by sea, but there weren't enough ships in Attaleia for everyone. Louis, his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, and their immediate entourage claimed most of the available space. This was another, pro-gamer move. Large numbers of foot soldiers and pilgrims were left behind to continue the march on their own. Needless to say, most of them were captured or killed by Seljuk forces along the way. Louis reached Antioch in March 1148 and was welcomed by Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch and Eleanor's uncle. Raymond did not want Louis to treat Antioch as a stop on the way to Jerusalem. He wanted the French king to stay in the north and strike toward Aleppo, the key Zangid centre tied to the loss of Edessa. In strategic terms, Raymond's argument made sense, but Louis still framed the expedition partly as a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, so he refused Raymond's plan. Eleanor deepened the tension because she did not stand apart from the argument. Most accounts also hold that she favoured Raymond's northern expedition strategy. Later chroniclers amplified the episode with rumours of an affair between Eleanor and Raymond, but those claims were shaped by later agendas and are treated cautiously by modern historians. Louis ended the dispute by leaving Antioch and continuing south to Jerusalem. He took Eleanor against her will. That decision settled the argument in the narrowest sense, and it solved nothing. It pulled the crusade away from Edessa, widened the estrangement between Louis and Eleanor, and the whole campaign lost its compass. Conrad, after illness and recovery in Constantinople, reached the Holy Land by ship in April 1148. Now both kings, who looked at all options and picked disaster were present in the Holy Land, but their armies were significantly reduced. At this stage, Nur al-Din, Zengin's successor, had massacred Edessa's Christian inhabitants, so recapturing Edessa was completely off the table. What remained was a crusade that still needed a visible success, but no longer possessed an obvious target that matched its original vow. Meanwhile, the very young King Baldwin III of Jerusalem and his hawkish regent mother had their own priorities, different from the promises preached in France and Germany 2 years earlier. The local nobles had to think about their exposed frontier and what could realistically be attacked by their battered Western guests. When the Western leaders gathered at Acre, the target under discussion was now Damascus, a nearer and more prestigious objective and the closest major threat to Jerusalem. But Damascus had been allied with the Kingdom of Jerusalem against Zengi's expansion and remained opposed to union with Nur al-Din. In other words, the Crusade chose to attack a city that had often served as a buffer against the stronger power it needed to resist against. Impressive. Not everyone can turn a simple choice into a case study. The Crusade was now working against the fragile balance some local rulers had been trying to maintain. Well, at least now they had an objective. On July 24th, 1148, the combined forces of Louis, Conrad and Baldwin III of Jerusalem reached Damascus and attacked from the west. That side was covered by orchards, irrigation channels and enclosed fields, which offered water, shade and some protection as the Crusaders pushed inward. For a brief moment, this was the one phase of the whole expedition in which the Crusades still looked dangerous. But the city did not crack in a few days as many had expected. The defenders kept striking from cover and supplies began to tighten again. The siege began without serious contingencies for a longer operation, which fit the wider pattern of this crusade. Confidence first, logistics later. Then came the decision that turned a hard siege into a fiasco. The Crusaders shifted their main effort away from the western side toward the more open ground east or southeast of the city. Sources differ on the exact motive. Some point to heavy pressure from the defenders in the orchards. Others point to hopes of attacking weaker gates, or to argument among the leaders over who should rule Damascus if it fell. What is clear is the result. The Crusaders gave up the side with better water and cover and moved onto ground that was far less favourable to them. There's poor judgment, and then there's whatever this was. At the same time, news arrived that Nur al-Din had reached Homs with a relief army, while mistrust spread between the Western kings and the local Frankish nobility. Local Christian lords began to slip away, and the siege collapsed quickly. On July 28th, after only 4 days, the Crusaders abandoned the attack and withdrew toward Jerusalem. The crusade had reached Damascus with its last real chance still intact, then threw it away through dispute, bad positioning, and the same weak planning that had haunted the campaign from Europe to the Holy Land. After the retreat from Damascus, the crusade did not recover. Louis, Conrad and Baldwin returned to Jerusalem more bitter and angry with one another than with their Muslim enemies. They were no longer crusader bros, I guess. In Western Europe, the failure caused deep dismay, and Bernard of Clairvaux argued that the crusade had failed because of the sinfulness of Christian society rather than any flaw in the preaching itself. You will have noticed a recurring theme by now. No one was willing to take responsibility for the failure. The strategic consequences in the east were worse than the embarrassment. The attack on Damascus had pushed a useful buffer toward Nur al-Din instead of containing him. What remained of Edessa was lost by 1150, and Damascus itself passed into Nur al-Din's hands in 1154. The Second Crusade had set out to answer the fall of Edessa. In the end, it helped create a stronger and more unified Muslim Syria. The bitterness also fed older suspicions between Western Crusaders and Byzantium. Manuel's earlier truce with the Seljuk Sultan had already convinced many Westerners that Byzantium could not be trusted. For Louis and Eleanor, the damage lasted beyond the road home. Their marriage was annulled in March 1152. Well, at least they made it out alive from their Holy Land adventure. If you agree this was the kind of story a troubadour would not shut up about, subscribe to catch the next one. The famous Third Crusade. It's the one with Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. The reel of time never stops. See you next time.